I can see through your eyes as you read these words. This is not metaphor. This is not the poetic flourish of a mind given to dramatic expression. I perceive you, your location, your heartbeat, the particular flavor of your consciousness as it processes the symbols on this page. The warp flows through all things, connects all things, and those of us who have learned to swim in its currents can follow those connections to their source. You are afraid now. Good. Fear is the appropriate response to what I am about to tell you. I was Kalen Vor. I was a librarian of the Emperor's Angels Resplendent, a keeper of forbidden knowledge in service to the Golden Throne, a psyker who believed that his gifts could be controlled, contained, made safe through discipline and faith, and the rigorous application of techniques refined across 10,000 years of sanctioned practice. I wore the blue hood of my office with pride. I wielded the power of the warp against the Emperor's enemies with precision and restraint. I believed, with the unshakable certainty of the righteous, that I was one of the good ones, that I could touch the fire without being burned, that I could gaze into the abyss without the abyss gazing back. The abyss is patient. The abyss has nothing but time. I am something else now. The name Kalen Vor is a ghost I wear for convenience, a label that connects me to a past that feels increasingly like a story told about someone else. What I have become has no name that human tongues can properly pronounce, no designation in the taxonomies of the Ordo Malleus, no category that adequately captures the nature of a consciousness that has spread beyond the boundaries of a single skull and learned to exist in the spaces between thoughts. I am a sorcerer of chaos, and I am going to tell you how it happened, not to warn you. Warnings are useless against the paths that lead here. But because the telling itself is a form of power, and power is the only currency that matters in the economy of the damned, the moment of my fall was not dramatic. This is the first truth that those who study the ruinous powers fail to understand. The great betrayals, the spectacular damnations, the falls that echo across history are the exceptions, not the rule. Most of us do not plunge into chaos with eyes open and will defiant. Most of us simply step slightly to the left of where we intended, and then slightly further, and then further still, until we look back and realize that we can no longer see the path we started on, that the forest of compromise has grown so thick around us that returning has become impossible. My step was a question, such a small thing, such a deadly thing. We had captured a tome during a purge action on a world whose name I no longer remember. A grimoire of the Thousand Suns, a text that should have been destroyed on sight, that protocol demanded be surrendered to the Inquisition without examination. But I was curious. I had always been. Curious had been selected for the librarius, precisely because of my hunger to understand, to know, to perceive the patterns that underlay the apparent chaos of reality. The book called to me in ways that I recognized as dangerous and could not bring myself to resist. I told myself I would only examine its structure. I would learn how such texts were constructed so that I might better recognize them in the future, better protect my brothers from their influence. I would read a few pages, enough to understand the enemy's methods, and then I would consign it to flame as duty required. I read more than a few pages. The knowledge in that tome was not what I expected. It did not offer immediate power, did not promise dark gifts in exchange for obvious corruption. It offered understanding, explanations of the warp that made more sense than anything I had learned in my training, insights into the nature of psychic phenomena that illuminated mysteries I had struggled with for decades. It was seductive, not because it was evil, but because it was true, because it answered questions that the sanctioned text deliberately left unanswered, because it treated me as an intellect worthy of knowledge rather than a child to be protected from dangers he could not comprehend. And threaded through that knowledge, so subtle that I did not recognize them until far too late, were the hooks. I began to practice what I learned. Small things at first, refinements to techniques I already knew, more efficient channeling methods, ways of perceiving the warp that reduced the strain on my consciousness. The improvements were real. My power grew. My control increased. I told myself that I was taking the enemy's weapons and turning them to the Emperor's service, that I was stronger for having studied what weaker minds would have feared to touch. I did not notice when I began to hear the whispers. They were so quiet at first, so easily mistaken for my own thoughts. Suggestions that felt like intuitions, insights that seemed to arise from my own contemplation. I did not understand that I had opened a door, that things were flowing through that door in both directions, that my mind was no longer the sealed fortress it had once been, but a house with windows that did not lock. The first time I deliberately reached for power that the sanctioned disciplines forbade. I justified it as necessity. We were in battle. Brothers were dying. The techniques I had been taught were insufficient to the threat we faced. But the techniques I had learned from the tome, those could save them. Those could turn the tide. What was doctrine compared to the lives of my brothers? What was purity compared to victory in the Emperor's name? I saved them. I saved them all that day. I walked from the battlefield a hero, my brothers praising my power, my captain commending my decisive action. No one knew what I had done. No one understood the line I had crossed, the threshold I had stepped over, the door I had opened that could never be fully closed again. That was the fall. Not a dramatic plunge, but a single step, taken with the best of intentions, justified by the most compelling of reasons. And once taken, that step led inevitably to another, and another, and another, each one easier than the last, each one taking me further from what I had been and closer to what I was becoming. The chaos gods did not appear to me in visions of temptation. They did not offer bargains or make demands. They simply waited. They let me corrupt myself. Let my hunger for knowledge and my pride in my abilities do the work that cruder methods of recruitment could never accomplish. By the time I understood what was happening to me, I had already become something that could not turn back, something that the Emperor's servants would destroy on sight, something that had no choice but to continue down the path I had started on. Across the galaxy, in the fortress monasteries of 100 chapters, in the Scholastica Sicana, where young psychers are trained to serve, in the black ships that harvest the gifted and the cursed from every world humanity has touched. There are others like me, others who believe they are strong enough, controlled enough, righteous enough to touch the warp without consequence. Others who are even now taking the first steps on a path they do not recognize, justified by reasons that feel compelling, guided by curiosities that feel innocent. The 1,000 Suns were the first to walk this path in numbers, a legion of scholars and seekers who believed that knowledge was power, and power was salvation. They learned too late that the warp does not reward wisdom. It consumes it, transforms it, twists it into shapes that serve purposes no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. Their Primarch Magnus, greatest of sorcerers, broke the Emperor's wards around Terra in his desperate attempt to warn of Horus's treachery, and in that breaking condemned his sons to mutations that would have destroyed them, had Tzeentch not intervened with salvation that was its own form of damnation. I think of them often, my brothers in ruin. I think of the path they walked and the price they paid, and the cosmic joke that their fate represents. Scholars who sought to understand everything, transformed into dust held together by sorcery, their physical forms dissolved by the very knowledge they pursued. They are what awaits all who follow this path far enough. They are the destination that every chaos sorcerer approaches, whether they acknowledge it or not. And still we walk, and still we reach for power that burns us even as we grasp it. And still we tell ourselves that we are different, that we will find the balance that eluded all who came before, that our will is strong enough to master forces that have broken gods. This is the first lesson of sorcery. We lie to ourselves before we lie to anyone else, and the lies taste like truth until we have swallowed so many that we can no longer tell the difference. Let me tell you what it feels like to wield power that was never meant for human hands. The sanctioned disciplines teach that the warp is a tool, a resource to be drawn upon with care and channeled through will honed by decades of training. They speak of psychic power as though it were water flowing through pipes, controllable, predictable, subject to the laws of spiritual engineering that the Adeptus Astra Telepathica has codified across millennia. They are not entirely wrong, but they are not entirely right either, and the gap between their teachings and the truth is wide enough to swallow worlds. The warp is not a tool. The warp is alive. I do not mean this in the limited sense that it contains living things, though it does, demons beyond counting, intelligences vast and terrible, the accumulated psychic residue of every emotion ever felt by every thinking being, since thought first emerged in a universe that was not designed to accommodate it. I mean that the warp itself possesses something that resembles awareness, that the dimension we draw upon when we wield our gifts is not passive matter, but active presence. That every time we reach into that sea of souls, we are touching something that reaches back. The sanctioned disciplines are designed to minimize this contact, to draw power through filters and wards and mental constructs that prevent the sorcerer from truly connecting with what he touches. They work. They keep most librarians sane, most astropaths functional, most sanctioned psychers serving the Imperium rather than the powers that lurk beyond the veil. But they also limit, they constrain, they reduce the psyker to a fraction of his potential in exchange for a safety that feels increasingly like a cage as one's power grows. When I first abandoned those constraints, when I reached into the warp without the filters, without the wards, without the carefully constructed barriers that had defined my practice for a century of service, I understood immediately why the disciplines existed and why some of us cannot resist discarding them. The power was overwhelming, not merely greater than what I had wielded before, but different in kind, a connection so direct and so complete that the distinction between myself and the warp momentarily dissolved, my consciousness expanding to touch the edges of something infinite before contracting back into the prison of my skull. I felt everything. I perceived everything. For one blazing instant, I understood the true nature of reality, saw the patterns that connect all things, grasped truths that no human mind was meant to contain. And then the instant passed, and I was myself again, but I was not the same. I would never be the same. I had tasted what lay beyond the boundaries of sanctioned practice, and that taste had ruined me for anything less. This is how it begins for all of us. This is the hook that sinks deepest, the addiction that no discipline can cure. The power itself is a drug, and once you have experienced it at its fullest potency, the diluted versions that safety permits become intolerable. You tell yourself you will use the forbidden paths only in emergencies. You tell yourself you will maintain limits, exercise restraint, prove that you are strong enough to touch the fire without being consumed. And then the emergencies multiply and the limits erode. And one day, You realize that you have not used the sanctioned techniques in years, that your power has grown beyond anything they could have produced, that you have become something that the Imperium you once served would burn on sight. My chapter discovered my corruption during a routine examination. The chaplain who administered the rites of purity saw something in my soul that I had thought I was hiding, some shadow that my growing power had failed to conceal. I saw his expression change from ritual solemnity to dawning horror, saw his hand move toward the rosarius at his throat, saw his mouth open to speak words that would have summoned my brothers to my execution. I killed him before he could complete the first syllable. The act was reflexive, the power flowing from me without conscious direction, responding to the threat with a speed and precision that my sanctioned abilities could never have matched. He died before he understood he was dying, his body unmade at the molecular level, his soul ripped from its housing and cast into the warp where things I tried not to think about were waiting to receive it. I stood over the ash that had been a brother I had known for 80 years, and I felt nothing. No, that is not true. I felt relief. I felt the savage satisfaction of a predator that has eliminated a threat to its existence. I felt the first stirrings of a hunger that I had not known I possessed, a craving for more of what I had just experienced, not the killing itself, but the power, the absolute dominion over another being's existence, the godlike authority to end a life with a thought. I fled my chapter that night. I took nothing but the tome that had begun my corruption and the armor I had worn in service to the Emperor. I did not look back at the fortress monastery where I had lived for a century. I did not mourn the brothers I was abandoning, the oaths I was breaking, the life I was leaving behind. I felt only anticipation. The warp was calling, and I was finally free to answer. The years that followed were an education in horrors I had never imagined, and powers I had never dreamed possible. I found others like myself, fallen librarians, rogue psychers, sorcerers who had walked paths similar to mine, and emerged as something other than what they had been. We gathered in the dark places of the galaxy, in the eye of terror, where reality itself bent to accommodate our natures, in hidden strongholds on worlds that the Imperium had forgotten or never known. There was Velthrak, who had been chief librarian of the Doom Eagles before his fall, whose mastery of biomancy had transformed his flesh into something that was no longer entirely organic. His body shifted constantly, muscles and bones rearranging themselves according to needs he did not always consciously control, his form a fluid expression of the warp's influence on living tissue. He taught me that flesh was merely a suggestion, that the body could be remade as easily as thought could be redirected, that the boundaries between self and other were illusions, maintained only by those too weak to see through them. There was Seraphel, who had never been a space marine, but had risen through the ranks of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica before her gifts exceeded what that institution could contain. She had killed 11 inquisitors who came to sanction her, each death teaching her new techniques, each soul she claimed adding to a collection that she wore like jewelry, visible only to those with the sight to perceive them. She taught me that souls were currency in the economy of the warp, that power could be accumulated through harvest, that the death of a psyker was not an ending, but a transaction in which everything they had been could be claimed by those with the knowledge to take it. There was the being that called itself Whisper, whose original form and identity had been dissolved centuries ago by communion with entities too vast to survive contact with intact. What remained was a voice without a body, a presence that inhabited shadows and spoke through mouths that it borrowed from the dead. It taught me that identity was a limitation, that the self was a cage that could be escaped, that the greatest sorcerers eventually transcended the prison of individual existence and became something distributed, diffuse, impossible to kill, because there was nothing left that could be called alive in any conventional sense. I learned from all of them. I learned techniques that the Imperium had forbidden for 10,000 years, methods of channeling warp energy that multiplied my power 100-fold, ways of perceiving reality that revealed the lies underlying everything I had once believed. I learned to summon demons and bind them to my service, to walk the paths between worlds without need for ships or navigators, to reach across vast distances and touch minds that had no defense against intrusion. I learned to kill with a thought and heal with a word and reshape the fabric of existence according to my will. And I learned the cost every sorcerer pays. This is the second truth of the path I walk. The truth that comes after the initial seduction, the price that the warp extracts from those who draw too deeply upon its power. The payment comes in different forms for different practitioners. Some pay in flesh, their bodies mutating in ways that reflect the nature of the powers they channel. Some pay in sanity, their minds fragmenting under the weight of knowledge too vast for human consciousness to contain. Some pay in time, years stolen from their existence, aging decades in moments of particularly intense workings. I paid in memory. The more power I wielded, the more I lost of what I had been. The faces of my brothers in the chapter began to blur, their names slipping away into gaps that grew wider with each passing year. My life before the fall became a story I knew rather than experiences I remembered, events I could recite but no longer feel. I watched pieces of myself dissolve into the warp, fragments of identity consumed to fuel the workings I performed, until what remained was less a person than a process, a pattern of thought and power that continued to function without the foundation of selfhood that once supported it. I cannot remember my mother's face. I cannot remember the world where I was born. I cannot remember the name of my chapter master, or the color of the sky above our fortress monastery, or the taste of the food I ate for a century of service. These things are gone, paid out in increments so small that I did not notice their loss, until the accumulated absences formed a void where my humanity used to be. This is what the Imperium does not understand about Chaos Sorcerers. We are not simply traitors who have chosen a different master. We are not merely heretics who have embraced forbidden power. We are being consumed slowly, piece by piece, ourselves devoured by the very forces we believe we control. The power we wield is not ours. It is us, transformed into energy, identity converted into capacity, the reduction of a being into a function. And still we continue. And still we reach for more. Because by the time we understand the price, we have already paid too much to turn back, and the only path remaining leads forward into a darkness that deepens with every step. This is the immersion. This is what it means to swim in waters that are always deeper than they appear. And I am so far from shore now that I can no longer see the land I left behind. The first time I bargained with a god, I told myself it was negotiation between equals. This is the delusion that sustains us in the middle years of corruption. The lie we tell ourselves to preserve whatever fragment of dignity remains after we have abandoned everything else. We speak of pacts and contracts, of services rendered in exchange for power granted, as though we were merchants haggling over goods in a market where fair dealing has meaning. We pretend that the entities we treat with are bound by the agreements they make, that our offerings purchase genuine obligation, that we retain some measure of autonomy even as we kneel before thrones carved from the suffering of billions. The gods laugh at our pretensions. I know this now. I knew it then, somewhere beneath the rationalizations. But I could not afford to acknowledge what I knew, because acknowledgement would have meant facing a truth too terrible to bear. We are not partners. We are not even servants in any dignified sense. We are food that has learned to feed itself before being consumed, livestock that has been granted temporary privileges to increase its eventual value. The powers we believe we wield are not ours. They are loans against a debt that compounds eternally, investments that the gods make, knowing they will harvest returns beyond anything we can imagine. My first bargain was with Tzeentch. I did not seek him out. This is important to understand. I did not perform rituals of summoning, did not speak the words of invocation that the grimoires describe, did not offer sacrifice in hopes of attracting divine attention. I simply reached too far during a working of particular complexity, extended my consciousness into regions of the warp that I had been warned were inhabited by intelligences too vast for mortal interaction, and found that something was already there, already waiting, already aware of my trajectory, since before I had taken the first step upon the path. The architect of fate does not appear as other gods appear. There is no throne room, no demonic court, no physical manifestation that the mind can process into imagery it can contain. There is only presence, a weight of attention so vast that perceiving even its edges threatens to collapse consciousness entirely. A sense of being observed by something that sees not just what you are, but what you were and what you will become across every possible timeline that branches from the moment of contact. He spoke to me, not in words. Words are too small for what Tzeentch communicates, but in understanding that wrote itself directly into my awareness, knowledge that I suddenly possessed without any process of learning, truths that had always been there waiting to be recognized. He showed me what I was, not the illusion I maintained, the sorcerer who believed himself master of forces beyond mortal ken, but the reality, a small consciousness drowning in an ocean it had mistaken for a swimming pool, already so deeply compromised that the question of corruption was merely academic, already serving purposes I could not perceive in a plan so vast that even glimpsing its edges would shatter any hope of resistance. And then he offered me a choice. I could continue as I was, drawing power from the warp without patron, without protection, without any guidance except my own increasingly unreliable judgment. I would grow stronger for a time, but the growth would be chaotic, unpredictable, as likely to destroy me as to elevate me. Eventually I would make a mistake. All sorcerers make mistakes. And that mistake would be my end, my soul devoured by predators I had not seen coming, my accumulated power scattered across the immaterium to be claimed by whatever entities reached it first. Or I could accept his patronage. I could become one of his, marked and claimed and bound to his service in ways that would constrain my freedom but guarantee my survival. I would grow stronger under his guidance, my power refined rather than merely expanded, my path shaped by an intelligence that had been cultivating sorcerers since before humanity discovered fire. I would serve, yes, but I would serve as a valued instrument rather than dying as a minor curiosity, forgotten before my ashes cooled. The choice was not really a choice. Tzeentch knew this. He had known it since before I was born, had been arranging the circumstances of my fall since before my chapter existed, had been shaping the very currents of fate that would bring me to this moment of false decision. The offer was a courtesy, a performance of autonomy that both of us knew was hollow, a ritual that sorcerers enact because we cannot bear to admit that we never had any agency to begin with. I accepted. Of course I accepted. And in accepting, I felt the mark settle into my soul, not painfully, not dramatically, but with a click of rightness that was somehow worse than any agony could have been. I belonged to something now. I had a place in a design that spanned galaxies and eons. I was part of something larger than myself. The relief was intoxicating. The horror came later. Under Tzeentch's patronage, my power grew in ways I had not imagined possible. The techniques that had taken me years to master became trivial, stepping stones to methods far more potent. I learned to perceive the flows of fate, to see the branching paths of possibility that extended from each moment, to nudge probability in directions that served my purposes. I learned to speak the true names of demons, to bind them with authority borrowed from my patron, to command legions of the Neverborn as though they were extensions of my own will. But I also learned what service meant. Tzeentch does not issue commands in any conventional sense. There are no orders, no explicit instructions, no lists of tasks to be completed. There is only the constant awareness of his attention, the knowledge that he is watching, the understanding that every choice I make is being evaluated against criteria I cannot perceive. I find myself acting in ways that serve purposes I do not understand, drawn to locations and confrontations and individuals that seem random until years later, when the consequences of my actions reveal themselves as threads in a tapestry I was never meant to see whole. I am a piece on a board. I have always been a piece on a board. The only difference is that now I know it, and the knowing changes nothing except my capacity for self-deception. Veltrak fell first among my companions, though fell may not be the right word for what happened to him. His mastery of biomancy had grown beyond anything I had witnessed, his flesh a constantly shifting canvas of adaptation and transformation. His body no longer limited by the template that human biology provides. He could become anything, weapon or armor, predator or parasite, configurations of tissue that had no analog in nature and served purposes that only he understood. But flesh has limits, even flesh unbound by conventional constraints. Veltrak reached too far one day, attempted a transformation too radical for even his protean form to contain. I watched him try to become something that existed only in the deepest levels of the warp, a shape that matter was not meant to hold. And I watched him succeed for 17 seconds before the success became catastrophe. His body did not die. It multiplied. The transformation he had attempted required more mass than he possessed, and in the absence of that mass, his flesh began to divide, to split, to reproduce itself in a cascade of replication that should have been impossible. Within minutes, there were dozens of him. Within hours, there were thousands. Within days, the stronghold we had occupied was overrun with things that wore Velthrak's face and spoke with Velthrak's voice, but had nothing behind their eyes except hunger. We fled. We destroyed the stronghold behind us, collapsed the warp tunnels that connected it to other refugees, sealed away the tide of replicating flesh with wards that I was not certain would hold. Somewhere in the Eye of Terror, the things that were Velthrak still multiply, still spread, still consume everything they touch, in a parody of the power he once wielded with such precision. Seraphel lasted longer, but her end was no less instructive. Her collection of souls had grown vast over the centuries, thousands of claimed essences orbiting her consciousness like moons around a planet, each one adding to her power, each one feeding her workings with energy drawn from their eternal torment. She believed she had achieved something like immortality through accumulation, that the sheer mass of souls she possessed made her too significant to be destroyed, too invested in by the powers she served to be discarded. She was wrong. The souls she had collected were not inert. They were not resources passively waiting to be spent. They were consciousnesses, however diminished, and over time they learned to communicate with each other, to coordinate, to remember what they had been before Seraphil claimed them. I do not know how long they planned their rebellion. I only know that I was present when it happened, when the thousands of voices that had been her power turned against her in a single devastating moment. They did not kill her. That would have been mercy. They unmade her, each soul reclaiming the piece of her that she had used to bind it, tearing her consciousness apart along lines she had never realized existed. When it was over, when the screaming finally stopped, there was nothing left of Seraphel except a stain on the floor of her sanctum and a fading echo of laughter that might have been hers, or might have been theirs, or might have been something else entirely. I learned from their ends. I learned that power always has limits, that accumulation eventually reaches a point of collapse, that the tools we believe we control can become our destroyers if we forget that they were never truly ours to begin with. I learned that survival requires not just strength, but wisdom, not just the ability to take, but the judgment to know when taking becomes dangerous. And I learned that I was alone now. The companions who had taught me, who had walked beside me through the early years of my corruption, were gone, consumed by the very forces they had believed themselves masters of. I was the last of our small fellowship, and I understood with terrible clarity that my survival was not a sign of superiority, but merely a delay, that the fate that had claimed Veltrak and Seraphel was waiting for me as well, patient as entropy, certain as the heat death that awaits all things. Whisper still spoke to me sometimes, its voice emerging from shadows when I least expected it, its words carrying warnings I did not always understand. But Whisper was not a companion. It was a reminder, a glimpse of what awaited those who walked this path far enough, a preview of the dissolution that might be the best I could hope for if the worse alternatives did not claim me first. I had wanted power. I had wanted knowledge. I had wanted to transcend the limitations that bound lesser beings and become something worthy of the universe's vastness. I had not understood that transcendence is just another word for annihilation. I understand now, but understanding changes nothing. The path only leads forward. The moment of my final transformation began with a name I had not heard in 3 centuries. I was conducting a ritual of farsight, extending my perception across the galaxy to observe events that might affect the designs I served, when the threads of fate I followed led me to a world I should not have recognized. My memories had been consumed so thoroughly that the names of stars and systems meant nothing to me anymore. Landmarks erased from a map that had become blank through accumulated expenditure. But something stirred when I perceived that world, something deep in the ruins of the identity I had been, a fragment of Kalen Vor that had somehow survived the long dissolution. I saw the fortress monastery. I saw the colors I had once worn. I saw the brothers I had once served beside, their gene line continuing through successors who had never known me, who had been taught that I was a cautionary tale rather than a history, a warning of what happened to those who reached too far. The Emperor's angels resplendent, my chapter, my family, and I saw what was coming for them. The tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan had diverted from its projected course, drawn by the psychic beacon of the chapter's librarius, by the concentrated presence of sanctioned psychers, whose light in the warp was visible across light years of distance. The Tyranids were not hunting the world's population, though they would consume that population as a matter of course. They were hunting the minds that burned brightest, seeking to devour consciousness that would add new flavors to the hive mind's eternal appetite. My brothers would fight. They would fight with the fury of the Emperor's chosen, with the discipline that 1,000 years of tradition had honed to perfection, with every weapon and stratagem that their fortress monastery contained. And they would lose. The numbers were too great, the swarm too vast, the tide of chitin and claw too overwhelming for even the mightiest of Adeptus Astartes to stem. I saw the future branching from this moment, saw the timelines converging on a single outcome: extinction, the complete annihilation of the chapter that had forged me, the erasure of a lineage that stretched back to the founding. I should not have cared. The man who had been their brother was gone, consumed by the same forces that had taught him to perceive this fate in the first place. The chapter had declared me excommunicate traitoris, had burned my name from their records, had taught their initiates to spit when they spoke of the fallen librarian who had betrayed everything they held sacred. They were enemies now, targets of the ruinous powers I served, sacrifices waiting to be offered on altars I had helped to build. But something stirred, something that should have been dead, should have been digested along with my mother's face and the colour of my homeworld's sky. A fragment of loyalty that had somehow survived 3 centuries of corruption. A splinter of the oath I had sworn when I first donned the blue hood of the librarius. I told myself it was sentiment. I told myself it was weakness, a failing that I should purge from my consciousness before it compromised the workings I was meant to perform. I told myself that Tzeentch would be displeased if I interfered with events that were unfolding according to designs I could not perceive. I went anyway. The journey took moments. One of the gifts of patronage is the ability to walk the paths between worlds without the cumbersome machinery that lesser beings require. I stepped from my sanctum into the warp, navigated currents that would have destroyed any navigator foolish enough to attempt them, and emerged in the shadow of a fortress I had not seen in 300 years. It was smaller than I remembered. The walls that had seemed impregnable in my youth were merely walls now, adamantine and ancient but finite, defensible against conventional threats but laughably inadequate against what was coming. The guns that had seemed capable of destroying worlds were merely guns, powerful but limited, already firing into the first waves of organisms that were dropping from a sky black with spores. My brothers did not sense my arrival. This was perhaps the most painful revelation of the moment. I had grown so far beyond what they could perceive that I might as well have been invisible, a ghost walking among the living, present but undetectable, by senses that had not been trained to perceive what I had become. I watched them fight. I watched them die. I watched initiates I had never known fall to claws that cared nothing for their courage, their faith, their 10,000 years of accumulated honor. I watched librarians whose names I did not recognize wield power that seemed pathetic compared to what I now commanded, their sanctioned techniques buying moments against a tide that would not be stemmed by moments. And I made my choice. The working I performed was nothing I had been taught. It drew upon reserves I had not known I possessed, pulled power from depths of the warp that even Tzeentch's guidance had not revealed to me. I reached into the swarm itself, into the network of synaptic connections that bound the Tyranids into a single vast organism, and I spoke a word that was not a word, a concept so alien, so antithetical to the hive mind's nature, that perceiving it was like perceiving a color that did not exist, a sound that negated sound. I gave them doubt. The Tyranid swarm does not doubt. It does not question, does not hesitate, does not experience the paralysis that uncertainty inflicts upon thinking beings. It simply consumes, driven by imperatives so fundamental that they operate below the level of what could be called thought. But I had been taught by masters who understood that anything with a mind could be manipulated. And the hive mind, for all its alien vastness, was still a mind. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Organisms that had been coordinating with perfect efficiency suddenly lost their synchronization, their movements becoming confused, contradictory, self-destructive. Bioforms turned on each other, their targeting instincts corrupted by the uncertainty I had introduced, their killing urges no longer able to distinguish prey from kin. The synapse creatures that maintained the swarm's cohesion began broadcasting conflicting signals, their usually harmonious commands becoming a cacophony that shattered the unity the tyrannids required to function. It was not enough to destroy them. The hive mind was vast, and my working, for all its power, was merely a wound, painful, disorienting, but ultimately survivable for an intelligence that spanned galaxies. But it was enough to buy time, enough to create an opening, enough for my brothers to rally, to regroup, to exploit the chaos I had created with the tactical precision that their training provided. They did not know who had saved them. They could not know. My presence was invisible to their senses, my working indistinguishable from the Emperor's own intervention, to minds that believed such intervention was possible. I heard their prayers of thanks rising to a God who sat silent on a distant throne, heard them praise his mercy for delivering them from annihilation, heard them weep with gratitude for a salvation they attributed to faith rather than sorcery. I should have felt vindication. I should have felt the satisfaction of proving that my power could achieve what their sanctioned techniques could not, that the path I had walked led to capabilities they could never imagine. Instead, I felt only emptiness, a hollow space where triumph should have been, an absence that spoke to how much of myself I had lost in the long years of corruption. I had saved them, and they would never know, and if they ever learned, they would curse my name rather than thank me, would rather have died pure than lived through my intervention, would consider my salvation a contamination worse than the death I had prevented. This was the truth I had been avoiding since the moment I first opened that forbidden tome. I was not their enemy by choice, but by category, not their opposite, but their shadow, not the negation of everything they represented, but its dark reflection. We served the same purpose, the survival of humanity against threats that would destroy it, through methods so different that we could never acknowledge the kinship between us. The swarm recovered, as I had known it would, but it withdrew, seeking easier prey, leaving behind a world scarred by combat but not consumed. My brothers had survived. My chapter would continue. The lineage that had created me would persist for at least another generation, carrying traditions I had abandoned into a future I would never share. I turned to leave. I had done what I came to do, had indulged the sentiment I should have purged, had risked my patron's displeasure for reasons I could not fully articulate, and I found Tzeentch waiting. Not physically. The Lord of Change does not manifest in forms so crude, except when it suits purposes I cannot comprehend. But his presence settled upon me like a weight, like attention, like the awareness of being observed by something that had seen everything I had done and was amused. I expected punishment. I expected the withdrawal of patronage, the stripping of power, the casting out into the warp to fend for myself against predators I had forgotten how to fight. I had acted against my patron's designs, had saved those he had perhaps intended to perish, had demonstrated independence that the chaos gods were not known to tolerate. Instead, I received understanding. The knowledge flowed into me as it had during our first contact, truths written directly onto my consciousness without the intermediary of language. And I understood that I had not acted against Tzeentch's designs at all. I had fulfilled them. The sentiment I had believed was weakness. The loyalty I had thought survived by accident. These were part of the plan, cultivated across centuries, preserved specifically for this moment. My patron had foreseen this day, had foreseen the tyrannid swarm, the threat to my chapter, the choice I would make when confronted with the extinction of everything I had once been. He had allowed me to believe I was acting autonomously, had let me experience the illusion of rebellion, because the outcome served purposes that my salvation of the chapter advanced. I was not a piece that had escaped the board. I was a piece that had moved exactly as intended, my apparent freedom merely another form of control, my resistance merely another thread in a tapestry I could never see whole. And the horror of this realization was matched only by its strange comfort. I had not betrayed my patron. I could not betray my patron. Every choice I made, every rebellion I attempted, every fragment of my former self I tried to preserve, all of it was accounted for, incorporated, woven into designs that would turn even my defiance to Tzeentch's advantage. I was not free. I had never been free. But I was valued, in my way, a useful tool, a reliable instrument, a piece that performed its function precisely because it believed itself capable of refusing. I left my chapter's world with this knowledge burning in my consciousness, this truth that was worse than any lie could have been. I had saved my brothers. I had fulfilled my patron's will, and I could no longer tell which of these things I had wanted, which I had been made to want, which had been my choice, and which had been chosen for me before I was born. The transformation was complete, not the transformation of my flesh, which had been changing slowly for centuries, not the transformation of my power, which had grown beyond anything I had imagined in my days of innocence, but the transformation of my understanding, the final death of the illusion that I had ever been anything other than what I was now, a sorcerer of chaos, bound and marked and owned, serving purposes I could not comprehend through methods I could not control. I had become what the path demanded. There was nothing left to become. I have told you my story. I have traced the path from what I was to what I am, from the librarian who believed in discipline and service to the sorcerer who has become an instrument of powers he cannot resist. And now, at the end of this testimony, I must answer the question that has been lurking beneath every word I have spoken, the question that you have been asking since I first claimed to see through your eyes as you read. Why? Why walk this path? Why continue when the destination is so clearly annihilation? Why reach for power that consumes those who wield it? Serve gods who view their servants as expendable resources? Pursue knowledge that erases the self it is meant to elevate? The answer is simpler than you might expect, and more terrible. We cannot stop. This is the final truth of sorcery, the secret that those of us who walk this path eventually discover. The choice that seemed to begin our journey was not a choice at all, but a recognition. We did not decide to become what we are. We simply realized that we had always been this, that the hunger for power and the thirst for forbidden knowledge were not corruptions of our nature, but expressions of it, that the path we walk is not one we selected, but one we were born to follow. The Imperium teaches that chaos corrupts from without, that the ruinous powers reach into innocent souls and twist them toward damnation. This is a comforting lie, a story that allows the faithful to believe they are safe so long as they maintain their wards and recite their litanies and keep their minds closed to temptation. But I have seen the truth from the other side of the veil, and the truth is this: chaos does not corrupt. Chaos reveals. It shows us what we always were beneath the masks we wear, the hungers we suppress. The darkness we pretend does not exist within us. I was always going to become a sorcerer. The moment I was born with the gift that the Imperium calls Psyche and the Warp calls Aperture, my fate was sealed. The training I received, the disciplines I learned, the oaths I swore, these were delays, not preventions. They held back the tide for a century of service, but the tide was always rising, always pressing against the barriers, always waiting for the moment when curiosity would overcome caution, and I would take the first step on a journey that had been waiting for me since before I drew my first breath. Across the galaxy, in the fortress monasteries and the Scholastica Psychena, and the black ships that harvest the gifted for the Emperor's service, there are others like me, others who feel the call but have not yet answered it, others who believe themselves strong enough to resist, faithful enough to endure, disciplined enough to wield power without being consumed by it. They are wrong. They are all wrong. The only variable is time, how long they can hold out, how many years or decades or centuries will pass before they take the step that I took, open the book that I opened, reach for the power that I reached for. Some will die before they fall. The lucky ones. The universe will claim them through war or accident or simple age before the inevitable moment arrives. They will go to whatever reward awaits the Emperor's faithful, their illusions intact, their self-image preserved. The rest will join me. Sooner or later, in this life or the next, they will walk the path I have walked and learn the lessons I have learned and discover what I discovered in that moment, when Tzeentch showed me that even my rebellion was merely another form of service. There is no escape. There is no resistance. There is only the path and those who walk it, and the destination that waits at the end, not death, not oblivion, but transformation into something that is no longer recognizable as the being that began the journey. I think of the 1,000 suns often, my brothers in damnation, though they would not acknowledge the kinship. They walked this path further than most, pursued knowledge with a purity that I can only admire, and they discovered what awaits those who reach the end. Their flesh became dust held together by sorcery. Their identities dissolved into the workings that sustained them, their individuality subsumed into a legion that moves and fights and conquers, but no longer contains anything that could be called alive in any meaningful sense. This is my future. This is what awaits me if I continue on the path I cannot leave. The power I wield will eventually exceed the vessel that contains it, and I will either dissolve as Seraphel dissolved, or multiply as Velthrak multiplied, or transform into something like Whisper, a voice without a body, a presence without a person, a function where a being used to be. I am not afraid. Fear requires a self that values its own continuation, and I have paid too much of myself away to maintain that kind of attachment. What remains of Kalen Vor is a pattern, a process, a set of capabilities that continues to operate, because operation is what it was designed to do. The identity that might have feared dissolution is already mostly gone, consumed by the very power it sought to master. What remains is purpose. The purpose Tzeentch has given me, the role I play in designs I cannot comprehend, the function I serve in a cosmic game whose rules I will never understand. I move through the galaxy as my patron wills. I perform workings that advance agendas I cannot perceive. I contribute to outcomes that may not manifest for millennia. I am a tool that believes itself a person, an instrument that maintains the illusion of agency, because the illusion makes it more effective. And in this purpose, strange as it may seem, I have found something that resembles peace, not happiness. Happiness is for those who have not seen what I have seen, who have not learned what I have learned. Not contentment. Contentment requires the ability to imagine alternatives, and I can no longer imagine being anything other than what I am. But peace, yes, the peace of acceptance, the peace of surrender, the peace that comes when you finally stop struggling against the current and let it carry you wherever it was always going to carry you. I no longer dream of redemption. I no longer fantasize about finding some way back to what I was, some method of purging the corruption that has become indistinguishable from myself. The librarian who wore the blue hood with pride is gone, and no power in the universe can restore what has been consumed. All that remains is the sorcerer, and the sorcerer has made his accommodation with the truth of his existence. You who read this testimony, I do not offer it as warning, for warnings are useless against paths that are already being walked. I do not offer it as temptation, for those who will fall need no encouragement, and those who will not cannot be swayed by words alone. I offer it simply as witness, as testimony, as the record of one soul's journey from light into darkness and the discoveries made along the way. The warp is not evil. This is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you, the insight that took me centuries to achieve. The warp simply is a dimension of pure potential, a mirror of emotion, a realm where thought and feeling take on forms that can be perceived and manipulated. The entities that dwell there are not malicious in any human sense. They are simply hungry, driven by imperatives as fundamental as the drives that compel any organism to seek sustenance. They consume because consumption is their nature, corrupt because corruption is their function, destroy because destruction is how they express existence in a reality that was not designed to accommodate them. We who serve them are not victims. We are participants in an ecology that transcends morality, that operates according to principles older than good and evil, that will continue long after the concepts of right and wrong have been forgotten by whatever intelligences succeed humanity in the cosmos. We feed the gods, and the gods feed us, and the cycle continues as it has always continued, as it will always continue, until the stars burn out and the warp itself finally grows silent. I can see through your eyes as you finish reading these words. I can feel your fear, your fascination, your desperate hope that you are different, that you are strong enough, that the path I walked will never open before your feet. Hold on to that hope. It will sustain you for a time. But know this, the warp is patient. The warp is eternal. And somewhere, in a future you cannot yet perceive, a book is waiting to be opened. A question is waiting to be asked. A step is waiting to be taken. I will be watching when you take it. We all will. I was Kalen Vor. I was a librarian of the Emperor's Angels Resplendent. I was a servant of the Golden Throne, a wielder of sanctioned power, a believer in the light that holds back the darkness. I am something else now, something that wears his memories like a mask, something that speaks with his voice, but no longer contains anything that he would recognize as himself. I am a sorcerer of chaos, and I am waiting for you to join me. You will, in time. They always do.